Action games have been around as long as the medium of video games has existed, but the arrival of Devil May Cry in 2001 represented a major turning point for the genre. Not only was it a landmark title for the then new PlayStation 2, it was also the game responsible for creating the character action subgenre. What separates a character action game from, say, a traditional action game or action adventure game is an emphasis on mechanically rich, skill-based combat rather than exploration or shooting down waves of enemies. Character action games are, at their core, the genre where player expression and skill ceilings meet, affording plenty of rewarding gameplay to those who like to take the time to dive into their combat systems and play with purpose, rather than simply mashing buttons in every encounter. Other than an emphasis on combat and fighting game style inputs, character action games don't really share much else in common. A quick look through the genre shows that they vary wildly in terms of their settings, protagonists, progression systems, and visual style. That said, we can definitively separate character action into two distinct eras and design philosophies. Games that can trace their lineage back to Devil May Cry, and the later, primarily Western-developed games that were influenced by the arrival of 2005's God of War, itself another major turning point in the growing character action subgenre. The recent announcement of Ninja Gaiden 4 and its pending arrival later in the year inspired us to take a look at some of the best games in the character action genre. A quick note about this list, we tried to stay away from including more than one game per series, but some sequels were so good that their inclusion on our list was practically a guarantee. So with that out of the way, let's dive into 15 of the greatest character action games of all time in order of their release date. The game that started it all, Devil May Cry is where we can officially chart the beginning of the character action subgenre. Hideki Kamiya's 2001 masterpiece infamously began its life as the original version of Resident Evil 4, but its legacy extends well beyond those initial first steps to stand as both one of the greatest games of the 6th generation and one of the only titles in that era to birth its own subgenre of gaming. For those of us who were avid gamers at the time of Devil May Cry's launch, it was like nothing else. Enemies were plentiful, Dante was an effortlessly cool protagonist, and the game's combat was both flashy and stylish, bringing the spectacle of a 3D fighter into the realm of an action game. Kamiya and many other members of the Little Devils team within Capcom would eventually establish Platinum Games, whose work takes up a significant portion of this list. But the original Devil May Cry is still an impressive and groundbreaking achievement nearly a quarter century later, and it stands as one of Kamiya's greatest titles. Like Resident Evil before it, Devil May Cry's success would pave the way for several other developers to attempt to capture lightning in a bottle by following in Capcom's footsteps, and one of the first, and surprisingly greatest, games that owes its existence to Devil May Cry is Tecmo's Rygar, the legendary adventure. While the game does feature a setting inspired by Greek mythology and a protagonist who wields a weapon they swing around on a chain, don't be fooled into thinking that Rygar is a sort of proto-God of War. On the contrary, Rygar is definitively from the Devil May Cry school of design, and it does a commendable job of replicating its best elements without being an outright copy-paste in a new setting. Just a few short years after Capcom created the character action subgenre with Devil May Cry, Tomonobu Itagaki and the rest of Team Ninja would come along and deliver the title that many consider to be its pinnacle, 2004's Ninja Gaiden. This character action reboot of the Ninja Gaiden series bears a lot of the trademarks that made the original trilogy of NES action platformers so beloved, including incredibly responsive and fluid controls, some razor-sharp combat, and a substantial challenge that pushes players to their limit even within just the first stage. Appropriately, Ninja Gaiden doesn't pull any punches, and it's still one of the best games in the genre, only to be outdone by its sequel just a few years later. The release of God of War in 2005 represents the first major fork in the road for character action games, with many future titles following in either its footsteps or those of Devil May Cry as the genre continued to grow. Going back and playing the original God of War today kind of makes you stop and take notice at how many of its ideas we now take for granted as staples of the action and character action genres, such as its infamous climbing mechanic, emphasis on quick-time events, combat centered around crowd control versus stylish show-offs during one-on-one encounters, and an impressive sense of scale in its environments and set-piece design. Beyond its innovations on the gameplay side of things, though, God of War is one of the first character action games to prove that the genre can go hand in hand with a great story, as well as giving us Kratos, the first protagonist in the genre since Dante that's anywhere near as iconic. The first Ninja Gaiden was such a massive win for Microsoft and the Xbox that the company decided to fund and publish a sequel as a console exclusive for the Xbox 360, with the game finally releasing in the summer of 2008. Like its predecessor, Ninja Gaiden 2 is a tough-as-nails character action game with peerless combat and a steep difficulty curve. But it's also one of the funnest, most satisfying games ever made. Despite its white-knuckle combat not being for the faint of heart, Ninja Gaiden 2 fully delivers on just about everything you'd want from a sequel to the original. More weapons, grander spectacle, tighter controls, and a new dismemberment mechanic that results in every encounter being showered in a crimson spray. In many ways, Bayonetta is the true spiritual successor to Devil May Cry, especially given that it marks Hideki Kamiya's return to the character action genre after passing the reins of the Devil May Cry franchise to Hideaki Itsuno. Bayonetta is pure over-the-top, stylish action in a way that almost makes Devil May Cry seem tame, and the titular protagonist is one of the best heroines in gaming, not to mention one of the deadliest. Mechanically, Bayonetta still relies on the fighting game-style combo-driven combat of the Devil May Cry series, but Bayonetta herself has plenty of new tricks at her disposal, like magic-based torture attacks and a free-aiming gun finisher to combos, that give the game's combat its own unique flair. Bayonetta 2 and 3 are both excellent games, but it's hard to top the original in terms of its balance, gameplay, style, and importance towards revitalizing Japanese-developed character action games. With how many times the Darksiders series has changed genres, it can be easy to forget that the first game in the franchise was actually a character action title along the same lines as God of War. That original Darksiders game is a hugely underrated 7th generation title that basically asks what it would be like to throw in elements from a bunch of different popular games to see if they work together. And somehow, they do. While it does incorporate elements of the 3D Legend of Zelda games and even a surprising inclusion of Portal-style teleportation in some late-game puzzles, Darksiders is, at its core, all about its excellent combo-driven combat and impressive boss encounters. And in terms of its protagonist, you could do a lot worse than getting to control one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The 3D Castlevania games got off to a rough start on the Nintendo 64, and they didn't fare much better on the PS2, despite me having a personal soft spot for both Curse of Darkness and Lament of Innocence. So when it came time to take yet another stab at making a 3D Castlevania, Konami made the decision to outsource its development to the then-new studio Mercury Steam. Yes, the same Mercury Steam who would go on to make the excellent Metroid Samus Returns and Metroid Dread. That partnership resulted in both the best 3D Castlevania game and one of the best Castlevania games, period. While Castlevania Lords of Shadow definitely owes a major debt of gratitude to God of War, it does enough unique things to stand out as one of the better character action games, including some impeccable world design and towering bosses that feature Shadow of the Colossus-style puzzle elements in how the encounters play out.
What? They have a Metal Gear?
Shoehorning the stealth action Metal Gear franchise into a character action game seems like a forced concoction that shouldn't work, but Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is both a fantastic game and a great vehicle for the criminally underutilized Raiden. Years before From Software designed and developed Sekiro, Platinum Games would craft an entire combat system around parrying and deflection with Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. It's amazing how well controlling Raiden's katana skills holds up in a modern context. While its story is so hilariously bad and over the top as to come off as a parody of the Metal Gear games it shares a franchise with, Metal Gear Rising's gameplay is the real deal, and it's still one of the most satisfying character action games in the genre.
This must have been quite a city once upon a time.
Despite most character action games not being known for their stories, NieR Automata is a game that proves deep, rewarding combat and thought-compelling, introspective storytelling can coexist. The long-awaited sequel to misunderstood cult classic NieR, NieR Automata is a thrilling game that regularly switches up genres while simultaneously sticking to the established tenets of character action games, delivering a thrilling and cerebral experience that more than earns its necessary multiple playthroughs to see the true finale. 2B is both swift and nimble in combat while also effortlessly laying waste to hundreds of sentient robots, and it's easy to see how NieR Automata's excellent protagonist and fluid combat have gone on to influence more recent titles like 2024's Stellar Blade. Though there's a case to be made that every game in the Devil May Cry series belongs on a list of the best character action games, except for maybe Devil May Cry 2, Devil May Cry 5 is the first sequel in the franchise that truly captures the excitement and palpable cool factor of the original. Notably, that was the director's intention, with Hideaki Itsuno aiming to make DMC5 the best game in the series after his work directing the excellent third and fourth entries, not to mention a whole slew of other Capcom classics. Itsuno's intentions with Devil May Cry 5 were fully realized, with the game having some of the most insanely deep and rewarding combat of any title in the series, or any other character action game, along with some of the best boss battles in the genre. From Software knows what it's doing when it comes to combat, and Sekiro is perhaps its magnum opus in that regard. While the Dark Souls games and other From Software action RPGs give players an astounding amount of build variety, opening up multiple pathways to victory in any encounter, Sekiro challenges players to simply get good with the tools given to them. Accordingly, there's a purity to Sekiro's combat that escapes most modern action titles, and cements it as one of the greatest games ever made, action or otherwise. Completing Sekiro and defeating Sword Saint Ishin on the outskirts of Ashina Castle is both a mental and physical endurance test, pushing players to the absolute limits of their skill in a way that few character action games can, and leaving an indelible mark on those who overcome the challenge. Platinum Games' contract with Nintendo to produce a handful of titles exclusive to the Switch led to two excellent character action games, Astral Chain and Bayonetta 3. But while Bayonetta 3 is great, it's the unique and offbeat Astral Chain that earns its place as one of the best character action games thanks to its compelling sci-fi setting, awesome visuals, and incredibly unique approach to combat. Rather than control just one character, Astral Chain sees players control one of the two selectable protagonists and their legion at the same time. Both characters are tethered by the titular Astral Chain that binds them together, and controlling both the player character with the left analog stick and the legion with the right, circling around enemies and tripping them up at a moment's notice, is a unique experience in the genre and an absolute blast to boot.
They've blocked the entrance to the warehouse.
For those of us who cut our teeth in the arcades, Sifu was like a breath of fresh air. A modern-day take on the beat-em-up and a character action game, Sifu features some of the most brutally satisfying combat ever seen in either genre. The impact and force of each hit practically reverberate off the screen, making you almost feel bad for all the armed goons you have to take out. Almost. Sifu is also another game that takes its challenge seriously, but also offers plenty of accessibility options that open up the floor to less skilled players, giving them a great playground to grow their skills with its finely tuned combat and robust practice mode for training. Throw in Sifu's unique resurrection mechanic, which trades vitality for strength with each new life, and you have a certified modern classic. Like Sekiro before it, there's a temptation to refer to Black Myth Wukong as a Souls-like game simply because it's a difficult third-person action RPG, but playing Black Myth Wukong reveals that it actually shares a much closer lineage with Team Ninja's Ninja Gaiden games than anything remotely resembling Dark Souls. Black Myth Wukong is at once beautiful and brutal, wowing players with some of the most gorgeously jaw-dropping visuals produced in Unreal Engine 5, all while beating them over the head with one challenging combat encounter after another. The Destined one has a wide arsenal of fun abilities that each has its pros and cons to being used in combat, and figuring out the best way to tackle each boss fight is a thrill that immediately calls back to the best character action games of the 6th and 7th console generations. That's going to wrap up our list of 15 of the greatest character action games. Let us know your favorites in the comments below, and make sure to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.